It began as an ordinary suburban evening, tranquil, predictable, and deceptively pleasant. Claire Weston stood in her kitchen, bathed in the quiet hum of a familiar routine, yet unease clung to the air like a storm cloud brewing just beyond sight. Her husband David was late, not unusually late, but late enough to awaken the gnawing suspicion she had tried so desperately to suppress all week. David had changed recently. A cold, detached demeanor had crept into their interactions. He'd grown irritable, distracted, and unrecognizable in ways that went beyond the typical stresses of daily life. Tonight, however, felt different, darker, heavier. The phone buzzed, pulling Claire from her tangled thoughts. It was him. "Don't wait up for me," David said, his tone curt and distant. Something about the call didn't sit right. Then her eyes fell on something horrifying, a blood-stained knife tucked under a stack of magazines in their living room. Claire froze in place, her breath hitching. Her heartbeat turned into a deafening drumbeat in her ears. Something was wrong, terribly, grotesquely wrong. This wasn't the David she knew. Days passed, yet the man who returned home wore David's face like a mask, each interaction a cruel, uncanny imitation of what a husband ought to be. He behaved as though he remembered every detail of their life together. The way he smiled over dinner, the way he laughed at her jokes. They were David's mannerisms, but hollow, lifeless. Claire began unraveling his lies one thread at a time. Late one night, while he slept in their bed, she searched. It started with the attic. Beneath a dusty stack of forgotten boxes, she found them, photographs. Dozens of photos depicting people she recognized, neighbors, friends, co-workers, people who were now dead. They all bore the twisted, grinning visage of her husband. It wasn't just David who had changed. It was clear now, he wasn't David at all. That night, Claire felt the thing beside her stir, its arm curling too tightly around her waist. "You're all I have now," it whispered, the words laced with a distorted mockery of devotion. The voice sent icy needles through her spine. That same night, she discovered more lurking horrors. Hidden beneath their bed was a collection of weapons stained with the echoes of suffering. Knives, hammers, saws, tools of violence, weapons of a predator. This wasn't her husband trying to hold on to normalcy. This was a hunter carefully preparing for its next kill. Claire's fight for survival began in earnest. Trembling but resolute, she armed herself with the closest weapon she could find. She ventured into the cellar and found him. The real David. Bound, starved, and barely clinging to life, he looked at her with frail yet familiar eyes. She freed him, her hope rekindled by the chance to escape together. But the monster was waiting. It cornered them at the top of the cellar stairs, its twisted smile glowing with otherworldly glee. "You thought you could hide from me?" it sneered. The thing no longer bothered with pretense. Its facade crumbled, revealing the unnatural yellow gleam in its eyes. The ensuing confrontation was brutal. Blood spattered the walls as Claire fought desperately to protect her husband and herself. Summoning the strength of her deepest fears, she plunged a knife into its chest. The creature's response chilled her. It smiled as though exhilarated by her resistance. "This is only the beginning," it whispered before collapsing into lifelessness, its expression still frozen in that haunting smirk. When the police arrived, everything went from surreal to nightmarish. They accused David of being the culprit, the evidence damning him beyond a shadow of a doubt. After all, who else could have committed these gruesome murders? Shapeshifters don't exist. Such an idea would be absurd. Claire's warnings were ignored. She was dismissed as grief-stricken and delusional. David was dragged away in handcuffs, his pleas falling on deaf ears. And despite Claire's efforts to maintain her composure, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was now utterly alone in this fight. Months passed, and Claire's world became a fractured mirror of doubt and dread. Her visits to David in prison were filled with heavy silences. Every glance into his weary eyes left her questioning, was this man still her husband? Or had the monster somehow reclaimed its place? And then, late one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, shadows deepened across the neighborhood. Claire caught a glimpse of something in her periphery, her neighbor, Mr. Jensen, standing ominously in his yard. Her blood turned to ice. His eyes glinted yellow, the same soulless gleam that had haunted her nightmares. His mouth curved into a smile that wasn't his own. Claire stumbled backward, the realization crashing over her like a tidal wave. The monster wasn't dead. It had merely swapped faces, wearing Jensen like an eerie, fleshly mask. Somewhere in the darkness it laughed. Not loudly, but just enough for her to feel it vibrating in her bones. For the monster hadn't simply taken David. No, it was always one step ahead, a sinister shadow forever lurking in her periphery. And Claire knew, regardless of what she did, that it would always find her. Because this monster wasn't content with faces or lives. It wanted something far more terrifying. It wanted her.